Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really diving into an incredibly deep stack of theological sources. We're focusing on perhaps the most profound subjects of faith, the mechanics of divine sacrifice, the absolute justification of judgment, and, well, the ultimate purpose behind giving creation, humanity, and angels alike free will.
Yeah, this material is dense. It draws heavily on, Old Testament ritual, but connects it directly to the prophetic language of Revelation. So we're not just covering theology, we're looking at the legal and cosmic framework the source is present.
Right.
Key concepts we'll need to unpack include atonement, the meaning of the sacrificial altar, sometimes called the Bianjedan in the sources, and crucially, the distinction between different forms of death. That's a big one.
Okay, so our mission today is to kind of synthesize this complex framework. We need to understand how the Son's sacrifice functions as this multi-layered event. Why is it received by God as a beautiful offering of love, yet at the same time declares the certainty of judgment against sin? And importantly, we're going to spend significant time on this concept of the blameless beast, which is a powerful symbol the sources use to validate God's justice against, well, every accusation. Think of it as getting the philosophical, maybe even judicial, shortcut to why things happened the way they did.
Yeah, get ready to connect some major theological dots because we are addressing the very nature of free will, why it was necessary, why it almost inevitably led to sin, and how the cross was perhaps the only mechanism designed to complete it.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately then, starting with the cornerstone of the ancient ritual system, the burnt offering and the altar. The sources establish right away that this one act holds a massive duality. It represents both ultimate acceptance and ultimate destruction. It's sort of a paradox of fire, isn't it?
Indeed. We see two primary simultaneous functions at play when that sacrifice is burned on the altar. The first function is, well, it's beautiful and relational. The source establishes this by pointing to Leviticus 1.9, where the sacrifice is received by God as a fragrant aroma, a pleasant offering.
And we can't overstate the importance of that word, fragrant. It's not just, a nice smell. It's a signal of divine acceptance and pleasure. I mean, the smell of death usually signals defilement or corruption, right?
Absolutely.
But here, the burning, the ultimate destruction, actually creates an acceptable fragrance. How does that work?
That's right. The source explains that this fragrance symbolizes the perfect, unreserved love and sacrifice of the Son. It draws a direct parallel to Ephesians 5.2, where Christ gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So when God smells this, he is smelling the love, the obedience, the total surrender of the Son, a sacrifice completed in suffering.
And what specific suffering does the source focus on here? Because sacrifice implies suffering.
It emphasizes the spiritual agony of abandonment, that terrible pivotal moment on the cross captured in Matthew 27.46, when the Son cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's the core of the suffering being symbolized here.
Ah.
Exactly. So the fragrant aroma is the divine acceptance of that suffering, the self-abandonment that sin necessitates. The Son took on the full spiritual penalty of being cut off from the Father, yet because he did so out of perfect love and obedience, the Father receives the act as the ultimate expression of devotion. It's his love, proven through that intense suffering, that is the aromatic offering.
Okay, so that is the acceptance, the restorative side of the altar. But then the source immediately pivots and says that same fire, fueled by that same sacrifice, simultaneously symbolizes total judgment.
Yes, it's a duality. The burning altar also represents the consuming of sin. It draws on verses like Psalm 37.20, which speaks of the wicked vanishing like smoke. The fire is God's wrath against the perpetration of sin itself.
So the act of burning represents what exactly?
It represents the final consignment of transgressors, specifically Satan and his followers, according to these sources, to the lake of fire. This is presented as the ultimate destination of sin.
So the same ritual act holds these two opposing forces. The love of the Son is consumed, offering a fragrant aroma, and the sin that necessitated that consumption is also consumed, but as judgment. Now, the source makes a rather startling claim here, stating that the sacrificial offering, the gemel, also symbolizes Satan and his followers. How does it draw that connection? Because normally we think of the sacrifice as purely representing Christ.
Right. That's a key interpretive point in these sources. They're using the term gemel contextually here to mean that which is consumed by the fire. So when the fire represents judgment, the object being destroyed in that judgment is the essence of sin, which the sources say is embodied by Satan and those who align with him.
Okay, yeah.
The source directly connects this burning to prophetic judgment scenes like those in Revelation 19:19 and Daniel 7:11, where the beast, the the Jimsung and its armies are destroyed and consigned to the burning fire.
Ah, okay. So it's about the finality of the burning. When the sun is symbolically burned, the fire stops at resurrection, symbolizing acceptance. But when the wicked are burned, the fire leads to complete annihilation, symbolizing absolute rejection. The physical act burning on the altar is the same symbol, but the outcomes are diametrically opposed.
That's the crux of the duality, yes. And the two meanings are inextricably linked. Why? Because the loving sacrifice of the Son is necessary precisely because sin requires that ultimate consequence, the lake of fire. The Son's suffering of abandonment is essentially his prepayment of the penalty that leads to annihilation, thus removing that fate from those who accept his sacrifice.
Let's elaborate on that crucial relationship, because it sounds like you're saying if the son hadn't experienced the abandonment, the justice system itself would have been incomplete. The penalty would still stand, requiring every sinner to face annihilation individually.
Absolutely, that's the argument. The Son voluntarily steps into the position of the abandoned. Think of it almost like a legal substitution. He absorbs the spiritual separation from the Father, which is defined here as the definitive pain of sin.
Okay.
His acceptance of abandonment on the cross mirrors the immediate fate of sinners, to be cut off from God. But, and this is critical, it stops short of the annihilation phase. The distinction between being forsaken and being annihilated is where the entire concept of salvation, according to these texts, resides.
That distinction, abandonment versus annihilation, is clearly vital. It feels like it needs its own dedicated discussion. Let's move to part 2 and really dissect the nature of death itself as these sources present it.
Yes, we must. We have to begin by defining the second death, or JJ Samang, as the sources term it. They are very clear. This is distinct from the first death. The first death is simply physical cessation, what every creature experiences when the body fails.
Okay, standard biological death. And the second death. You mentioned annihilation. The source defines this in really dramatic terms as complete annihilation, samaiol, in the lake of fire, citing Revelation 20.14. Annihilation is such a strong word. Why does the source insist on annihilation rather than, say, eternal torment or separation? What's the reasoning?
Well, the sources define annihilation as the complete, absolute removal of the being's existence. It's not just eternal suffering, like existing forever in pain. It is non-existence, gone. The text explicitly cites Psalm 7.90, "For yet a little while, and the wicked one will be no more, and you will look carefully for his place, and he will not be there." This emphasizes a literal, permanent erasure.
A literal erasure. Wow. Why is this final erasure necessary within the cosmic framework described by these sources? What purpose does it serve?
It's framed as necessary for, let's call it cosmic hygiene, maybe? The source argues that the purpose of the second death is to prevent the annihilated being from having any further influence, intellectual, spiritual, or physical, on the newly restored created order. If a truly wicked creature, one whose free will has been perfected against God, could somehow persist eternally, even in torment, it could potentially continue to taint creation in some way. Annihilation ensures the absolute restoration of a perfect, unmarred universe. And this fate is strictly reserved for those who are ultimately abandoned by the Father due to their final rejection of love, meaning their names are not found in the Book of Life, as Revelation 20.5 puts it.
Okay, this brings us back to that really challenging question. Did the Son suffer this second death? If he was abandoned, and abandonment is the path leading to annihilation, how is his sacrifice complete yet distinct from the ultimate fate of the damned?
This is the crucial nuance. It defines the entire Christian doctrine presented here. The Son suffered the pain of abandonment, that spiritual cutting off, which is the emotional and relational penalty analogous to what leads to the lake of fire. However, the source absolutely insists that he did not suffer the second death itself, meaning he was not annihilated.
Wait, hang on. If the Son suffered the pain of abandonment, the exact penalty that leads to annihilation, why does the source insist that he didn't suffer the second death? Doesn't that risk suggesting his sacrifice was somehow incomplete or maybe less severe than the ultimate fate of sinners?
That's a fair question. It's the difference between suffering the sentence being read out, you could say, and suffering the execution of the ultimate destruction. The proof, according to the sources, that the Son was not annihilated is his resurrection.
Ah, the resurrection.
Yes. Romans 6.9 states that Christ, having been raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. And Acts 2.24 says it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him.
So the resurrection acts as the Father's explicit retraction of the abandonment. He was forsaken, yes, during that period on the cross, but then he was immediately accepted back and validated. That brief window of abandonment was sufficient to pay the spiritual price, but the ultimate power of death, which is defined here as the second death, annihilation, could not hold him.
Exactly that. If the Son had remained permanently dead, if he had actually been annihilated, he would have remained, in effect, a servant of sin and death. The Father would then have had to cast him into the lake of fire with the rest of the dead.
Which would be unthinkable.
Completely. The source dramatically emphasizes that this outcome would be catastrophic because, citing Colossians 1:17, in him all things hold together. The annihilation of the Son would render the entire created order instantly unsustainable. It couldn't exist. So, his resurrection confirms the suffering was of abandonment, but critically not of ultimate, final non-existence.
Okay, this distinction is paramount. Now, let's apply this to us, to creatures currently living under sin. The source poses a great question here. Do those currently under sin feel the suffering of abandonment or the lake of fire right now? I mean, if sin leads to burning, why don't we feel that immediate consequence?
Right, and this is where the source makes a really profound theological argument centered on the integrity of free will. The idea is, if immediate, tangible, physical, pain-like actual burning or annihilation were to happen every time someone sinned, it would effectively eliminate genuine free will.
How so?
Because people would obey God purely out of a coercive fear of punishment, wouldn't they? Not out of volitional love. It would be behavior modification through pain, not a heart change.
So immediate painful consequence is essentially Satan's method of governance rule by force and terror, and that's fundamentally incompatible with God's stated purpose of seeking love. Like 1 John 4:18 says, perfect love casts out fear.
Precisely. If God governed by instant painful consequences, he would actually be validating Satan's methodology, undermining the entire cosmic experiment of love-based free will. Therefore, the full, ultimate pain of abandonment and the subsequent burning, the annihilation, is reserved for the final judgment, the Great White Throne, after all opportunities for repentance and completion have been exhausted.
But the source does acknowledge that current suffering is a reflection of being cut off from God. So how does that manifest, if not as immediate physical burning? What does it feel like now?
It manifests, according to the source, as mental and spiritual anguish. The source uses examples like deep depression, a profound sense of emptiness or meaninglessness, maybe the pervasive dread of isolation. This suffering, while it isn't the physical fire of the lake of fire, is presented as a faint reflection, a shadow of the ultimate pain of abandonment.
Like an echo.
Exactly. It's the existential realization of being cut off from the source of life and love even before the final verdict is rendered. It's the soul's reaction, perhaps, to realizing it is fundamentally alone.
I can see how that current spiritual suffering, that dread and emptiness, ties back to the first Adam.
Yes. Remember Genesis 3:10. When Adam and Eve sinned, their immediate reaction wasn't physical burning, it was dread, fear. Adam hid, saying, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid." That fear, that initial dread of abandonment, is the starting point. The suffering of abandonment experienced by the Son on the cross, that public ultimate separation in Matthew 27:46, is presented as the conclusion, the fulfillment of the dread first felt by the first Adam.
So the Son, the last Adam, endured the full final payment, the comprehensive spiritual suffering that the first Adam and all his followers who don't accept the remedy will ultimately face at the Great White Throne judgment, the Big Bochwa Simpande. But crucially, because the last Adam resurrected, he proved that he could endure the abandonment without succumbing to the annihilation.
It's the difference between suffering the fire and being consumed by it. He suffered the heat, you could say, but emerged whole. The first Adam, if not covered by the last Adam's sacrifice, will suffer both the heat and the consumption. This structural distinction between death types is absolutely essential for the source's framework. Abandonment is the penalty for sin. Annihilation is the final, irreversible consequence of rejecting the path back from abandonment.
That brings us really neatly into part 3, because the decision to choose love over instinct, which is the path back you mentioned, defines who is accepted and who is ultimately annihilated. We need to talk about what the sources mean by the image of God, and conversely, the beast.
Yes, this section defines the very criterion God uses to categorize creation, according to these texts. The source is arguing that being made in God's image, the Hananamui Hayongsan, isn't primarily a physical descriptor, nor is it based purely on intellect. It's relational.
Relational how?
God views creatures who possess genuine love, which the source consistently defines as perfect obedience to the commandment, as being made in his image, referencing Genesis 1:26.
So the image of God isn't inherent just because you exist. It's dependent on your moral and relational disposition toward the commandment. And creatures who lack this love, who reject the commandment, are seen by God as the beast, the Jimsung, destined for destruction, citing Psalm 49.20.
Precisely. The beast in this context isn't necessarily a literal monster, but a creature operating purely on instinct, force, or selfish desire. It lacks the capacity or the willingness to submit to the rational, loving commandment. The source clarifies that the commandment itself is the full expression of God's character and love, referencing Romans 13.9. And obeying the commandment is what perfects and completes the image of God within the creature, citing Galatians 4.12.
That idea of completion is fascinating. It implies that simply being created in God's image isn't the finish line. It's more like the starting block. You're not done yet.
Exactly. The source presents love as the ultimate gift, referencing 1 Corinthians 12.31, and it's seen as synonymous with eternal life, Youngsang, citing 1 John 5.20. Only creatures who have completed their free will by definitively choosing love, not just choosing obedience out of duty, but embodying the spirit of the commandment, can endure eternally. Anything less than that perfected love has an inherent flaw, a potential for failure.
Okay, this leads directly to the concept of the unfinished free will. Help us understand what that flaw was in beings like the pre-fall angels and the first Adam. They were perfect, weren't they?
They were created perfect, intelligent, and in God's image, yes. But their free will was not yet complete because they still possessed the possibility of sin. Their wills hadn't been, let's say, hardened and perfected by an absolute, irreversible choice for love, tested and proven. The source posits something quite radical. That any being with free will, unless that will is perfected through absolute tested love, will, given enough time or the right temptation, eventually sin. It's viewed almost as a flaw or a potential fracture, a hesidium built into any created, non-divine being with freedom.
That's a bold assertion. Eventual sin is almost a mathematical certainty for any created being with free will, unless that will is completed by a confirmed, irreversible choice for love.
And that's presented as why God designed creation and the cross the way he did. The sources argue that the entire cosmic project, including the temporary tolerance of sin, was specifically designed to provide the necessary testing ground to complete this free will, citing Colossians 1.20. The creature must move beyond the mere possibility of sin and make the choice for love absolute and final.
So the beast, the Jimsung, symbolizes not just Satan specifically, as in Revelation 13.6, but the principle of rejection. Any creature that refuses the commandment of love and chooses instead to live by instinct or force, like Psalm 49.20 suggests, this isn't just about a demonic creature, it's about the spirit of disobedience itself.
And the distinction between the image of God and the beast is profound in its implications for justice. The source notes quite logically that it's impossible to give a commandment to an actual animal, a literal beast. It operates only by instinct, as 2 Peter 2.1 says.
Right, you can't command your dog to love God.
Exactly. Therefore, when intelligent, free-willed creatures like humans or angels reject the commandment, they are, in effect, choosing to operate as beasts, driven by base instinct and selfishness, rather than by loving reason.
And what does the action of the beast reveal then, if it's just instinct?
But when it's guided by a fallen will, its actions reveal the true sin and wickedness of the one controlling it. Since the beast operates by instinct, its destructive actions demonstrate the malicious intent and lack of love in the ruler who guides it. It becomes a mirror reflecting the wicked authority behind it.
This connects back to the theme of dominion, doesn't it? Adam was initially given temporary rule over the earth and the beasts, according to Genesis 1.27.
Yes, that delegated authority to rule creation. But when Adam sinned, the sources say he ceded that ruling authority temporarily to Satan, referencing Luke 4.5, where Satan offers the kingdoms of the world. Now, while Satan claimed this delegated authority, the sources strongly emphasize that the ultimate control, the true inheritance, the Sengsagwan, always belongs to the Son. John 18.3 is cited, where Jesus says his kingdom is not of this world.
Okay, but the key is why the Son chose not to forcefully reclaim it immediately. If he had the ultimate right, why didn't he just shut down Satan right at the start?
Right.
Why the delay in exercising that authority?
The delay is framed as an act of both mercy and strategic justice. If the Son had asserted his full immediate authority before the plan of the cross was executed, the judgment of sin would have had to be enacted instantly.
And that judgment?
That judgment would have condemned the first Adam and all his descendants immediately, right alongside Satan. There would have been no chance for redemption. So, the source argues the delay provided the necessary time for the plan of completion of free will through the cross to unfold. It allowed time for creatures to make that necessary, irreversible choice for love. The Son essentially deferred the execution of his judgment authority to fulfill the promise of salvation first.
That makes the cross not just a payment for sin, but a necessary step in the cosmic judiciary process. It ensures the completion of free will before the final verdict is rendered.
Precisely. The entire delay hinges on proving that the commandment of love is, in fact, achievable by a creature with free will. Because if it's not achievable, then God is unjust and the whole system fails. And that brings us to the most complex and perhaps unique concept in these sources: the necessity of the blameless beast.
Right. This is where we confront Satan's central lie head-on. What is the fundamental accusation that Satan levels against God's justice, according to these texts?
Satan's primary claim, the core of his rebellion, is that the commandment is impossible for any created being to keep. It's too high a standard. Therefore, judging creatures by this unattainable standard means God is inherently unjust buoy, as Romans 3.5 touches upon.
And if Satan were right?
Well, if he were right, then free will would be meaningless, a cruel joke. God's governance would have to be based on coercion, not righteousness, because the only way to manage creatures would be through fear and force. This would essentially validate the beast's philosophy over the image of God.
Okay, so to justly judge Satan and prove the commandment is achievable, God required an unimpeachable witness, a zhengin, a creature who successfully passed the test, as referenced in Revelation 3.14, regarding Christ as the faithful witness.
Yes, the court of cosmic justice demands proof. The judgment of the ultimate beast, Satan, in the lake of fire can only be righteous if there is irrefutable evidence that the commandment of love could indeed be kept by a creature possessing free will, even while subject to the limitations of creation.
But wait, the sources just stated that every free-willed creature created up until that point, the angels who fell, the first Adam, already had a flaw, a hiyam, that inherent potential for sin. So where could this perfect witness possibly come from?
Exactly. The witness could not come from the existing created order because it was already compromised by that potential flaw. It had to come from the divine, taking on the created form. The Son became the first blameless beast, Hiyam Epnoen Jimsung, an image referenced in connection with the 144,000 in Revelation 14.4 who follow the Lamb.
Blameless beast. That's such a deliberate and paradoxical term. He didn't just become human. The source says he took on the cursed flesh, the Jojubado Hulk, citing Hebrews 2.14.
Yes. Let's clarify what that cursed flesh means in the context of these sources. It's talking about the body that resulted from the fall, the body that, according to Genesis 3.18, produces thorns and thistles, the Gasiwa Iankionkwi.
So not just a normal human body, but one inherently linked to the consequences of sin.
Yes. The cursed flesh represents the physical and psychological state corrupted by sin's entry into the world. It carries the natural inclination towards instinctual self-preservation, selfishness, and even rejection of God's commandment. It's the body designed to fail, you might say, prone to temptation.
And the Son willingly took on that corruptible state, the very nature associated with the beast.
Yes. And then demonstrated that even within those severe limitations, perfect love and obedience were possible.
That is the ultimate proof, then. He defeated the system from the inside out, using the very tools designed for failure. By fully obeying the commandment of love, referencing John 14.15, while living a sinless life in that fallen, weak state, citing Hebrews 4.15, the Son exposed Satan's entire claim as a lie. Satan said the standard was impossible. The Son demonstrated it was merely difficult, but achievable through reliance on the Father.
And this act serves the entire cosmos. It's a judicial declaration. The Son's perfection under duress provides the dual mechanism for the completion of God's plan.
Okay, so what are those dual implications of the Son's perfection as the blameless beast?
First, his death, being blameless, serves as salvation gorn for those who accept the commandment and follow him. He paid the abandonment penalty for them. That's the grace aspect.
And second?
Second, and equally vital for cosmic justice, his success confirms the absolute righteousness of judgment simpan for those who reject the commandment, referencing 2 Corinthians 2.15, where Paul speaks of being an aroma of life to some and death to others.
The logic seems undeniable based on this framework. If the Son, operating within the limitations of the cursed, fallen human condition, Tarakan Hajjeg Imam, was able to achieve blamelessness, then there is absolutely zero justification for the final judgment against any creature, whether angel or human, who sinned. Even the pre-fall angels who sinned without the limitation of the cursed flesh cannot claim the standard was too high.
It removes every possible defense. It completely dismantles Satan's claim that God is unfair. The Son, as the first blameless creature, validates the justice, the necessity, and the severity of the second death for the unrepentant beast. Furthermore, the Son's action allows for the emergence of other blameless creatures, humans who are perfected through their relationship with him, again referencing Revelation 14.4.
So these followers become the living witnesses, the Zheng dual. They confirm through their transformed lives that the commandment is attainable through grace, which further solidifies the justice of the judgment against Satan. They are the proof that free will can be completed by love, transforming them from potential beasts into perfected beings in God's image.
Yes. The entire cosmological process, from the first sin in Eden to the final judgment at the Great White Throne, is thus revealed not as arbitrary punishment, but as a meticulous process designed to achieve perfect justice, validate love, and complete free will. The existence of the blameless creature confirms the justice of annihilation for the guilty beast.
That brings us to our final section then. We need to look at the physical mechanism of justice and atonement, which, according to the sources, involves the sacred nature of blood.
Right. We shift now to the literal life force used in the Mosaic system. The source references Leviticus 17.111 and 14 quite heavily, which state clearly that the life, or nephesh, often translated as soul of the flesh, is in the blood. Therefore, blood is the necessary element used on the altar to atone for the soul.
And this explains the strict Mosaic prohibition against consuming blood, like in Deuteronomy 12.2324. It's not just some ancient dietary restriction. It's rooted in a deep reverence for the sacred connection between blood and life itself.
Exactly. The blood is the vehicle of atonement because it carries the life essence. But the sources immediately pivot from the individual atonement seen in the sacrificial system to the necessary cosmic justice required for the earth itself, the creation. They cite Numbers 35.33. The land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of the one who shed it.
That is an incredibly strict principle of divine justice. If the earth, the creation, the Pishoji, is defiled by the shedding of innocent blood, that defilement can only be atoned for, cleansed, by the blood of the guilty party who caused it.
This is a crucial link in their argument. The source maintains that the entire sacrificial system prefigured this ultimate reality. The ritual killing of animals was essentially a placeholder, a symbol. As Isaiah 66.3 notes, the ritual killing itself doesn't please God. What the system symbolized was this necessary judgment. Satan, identified as the one who caused the earth's defilement with the blood of the innocent, must ultimately shed his own blood, meaning forfeit his existence and be utterly consumed in the lake of fire as the final payment for that cosmic defilement, fulfilling the principle of Numbers 35.33.
Okay, this means we're dealing with two entirely separate yet connected acts of bloodshedding, symbolically speaking. We need to clearly contrast the son's blood with Satan's ultimate payment or destruction.
Right. First, we have the son's blood. This was shed as the perfect, blameless sacrifice, as 1 John 2.2 implies. He suffered the abandonment on behalf of the innocent, those who would believe. His blood atones for our sin, enabling reconciliation with the Father.
It's restorative blood.
And second, we have Satan's blood, representing his life force or existence, which will be shed, meaning destroyed, as the guilty party in the final judgment, the simpan. This is the payment required to cleanse the defiled land, the creation. He will be subjected to the second death, meaning he will be completely consumed and annihilated. His destruction is not atonement. It is the final, irreversible execution of the penalty for his rebellion and the defilement he caused, referencing Psalm 9.12 about God remembering the blood of the afflicted.
This dual concept of bloodshedding, one for atonement, one for judgment, reveals the final implication of the judgment process for the believer then.
Exactly. The Father had already rejected sinjo rule biurisieta. Because sin had entered the world through Adam, all creatures under sin were initially considered abandoned, cut off from the source of life, as Ephesians 4.17 describes the state of the Gentiles.
But the Son's act provides the way back.
Yes, the Son's substitutionary act is the lifeline. Because the Son paid the exact cost of abandonment for the believer, Galatians 3.13 talks about him becoming a curse for us, the believer is accepted back. They are reconciled homokodome before the ultimate consequence of annihilation is executed. As Romans 5.9 says, we are saved from wrath through him.
So the believer avoids being cast into the lake of fire because they are covered by the perfect reconciliation achieved by the blameless creature. They were abandoned in Adam, positionally, but they are accepted back in the Son, a Son who successfully endured the abandonment but conquered the second death itself through resurrection.
It creates a closed loop of justice and love. The Son could not remain subject to death or sin's power. His victory over abandonment and rehabilitation, his subsequent resurrection guarantees that those who follow him are also accepted back before the point of annihilation. This ensures that their free will, now completed by love through faith in him, is secured eternally. The entire system, the whole structure of salvation and judgment, is upheld by the blameless creature's successful passage through the shadow of the second death.
Wow. Okay. What we've done here is synthesize a deeply intricate framework. We move from the seemingly simple ritual of the altar all the way to the macrocosmic question of why free will necessitated the cross in the first place. We started with that duality of the burnt offering, love and wrath, and ended up at the core argument about the judicial necessity of the Son's blamelessness, even in the cursed flesh.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here is how the source material reframes the concept of humanity, or even intelligent life. It insists that the true definition of being in God's image is fundamentally relational. It's about the capacity and the choice to obey the commandment of love. Any creature, regardless of its intelligence or origin, that chooses instinct and self-interest over love is categorized functionally as the beast. And the existence of free will demands that this choice, once made absolute, carries the ultimate consequence, either eternal life in love or annihilation.
And the irrefutable proof that the commandment is attainable, that God isn't unjust, isn't some abstract philosophical concept. It's the Son becoming the blameless beast, taking on the very flesh seemingly designed to fail, enduring the abandonment penalty, and succeeding perfectly through love and obedience. That success validates the eventual, necessary annihilation of all those who ultimately choose to live solely by instinct and reject love.
Which really raises an important, maybe deeply personal question for you, the learner, to consider. If the ultimate destination of beings who live solely by instinct and strength, the path of the beast, is the destruction of annihilation, what daily responsibility do those of us who recognize the commandment have? What's our responsibility to ensure our own free will is actively being completed by love and not dictated by the primal pull of that cursed flesh we still inhabit? How am I actively completing the image of God within ourselves today?
That is a powerful and, necessary thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the nature of judgment, sacrifice, and the ultimate test and completion of free will. We really hope this gives you much to mull over as you contemplate the vast implications of the altar and the blameless creature.